morning, audience. Hi, Chitra. So happy to be on the stage with you once again.
Always a pleasure, Vinita.
It's always lovely. We start chit-chatting together when on stage, so you'll have to tell us when to stop. We just start off. We forget that we are on stage. So our topic today is All the World's a Story, taking off obviously from Shakespeare's All the World's a Stage. Men and women are merely players, and they make their exits and entries. So I would say all the world's a story. Men and women are the mere writers of those stories, the writers and the tellers of those stories, and they have their beginnings and their endings. But do stories really have beginnings? Do stories really have endings? These are some of the questions that we'll discuss with Chitra here. We will wind up the session, say, about 15 minutes before time so that you have enough time to ask questions. So a bit about Write India. How many Write India participants are here today? Would you please put up your hands?
Wonderful.
Okay,
great to see you
great.
guys. Wave so we can see you.
And how many Write India winners? We have some Write India winners sitting here as well.
Oh, there you go. Congratulations.
Oh, there they are, yes. So these are, you are season 1 winners. Season 1 winners of Write India. And there are lots of season 2 winners also. Maybe some of them are coming because a lot of them told us that they will be here today. They are very enthusiastic to see you. And since Chitra is the author of the month for Write India, and Write India, as you know, is a project that we started with the Times of India in association with celebrity authors to encourage the habit of writing stories. Short stories is what we've started off with. And I see no reason to really change from there because short stories is what people love writing. And over the 1 year of season 1, we collected about 25,000 short stories, which was an amazing number. And this year, I'm not revealing the numbers right now, but I think we are going to be doing better than we did in this first season. So stories are a great way of engaging attention, as we all know. They are a great way of reaching across a message because they touch the right side of the brain, and that is where the messages stay. So the brain takes in your facts and figures, but the only way they stay glued in the mind is with the help of stories, because we love to follow people. We are interested in people, what happens to them, and that is the way that stories stay stuck in your minds. Stories emanate from communities, they emanate from traditions, they emanate from religion, they emanate from families. Each family has its own story. Individuals have their own stories. Businesses also have stories. As smart business managers, use those stories to tell you the story of an organization, or to encourage you, inspire you, or to make some organizational changes. So stories can be used in various ways. And we all have stories to tell. I don't think there'll be a single person here who doesn't have a story of his or her own, and not just one, but several stories. And when you have a story, you have to tell it, because a story that is not told dies. And after a story dies, we kind of lose our moorings, and we don't know what to do with ourselves. So our life is full of stories, and amazingly so. So without talking too much, I will hand over the mic to Chitra, and I want to ask you, is that right? Does everyone have stories, or do the writers, the authors, have more stories than any other individual?
That's a great question, Vinita. In fact, my novel, One Amazing Thing, now available in India also, is based around that premise. In that novel, in the beginning of that novel, a group of people, it's set in the US, and it has people of various different backgrounds, and they go to an Indian embassy to get a visa to come to India. They don't know each other. They've just landed at the visa station. And as they're waiting at that visa office, a major earthquake strikes. And now they're trapped in that basement in a very life-threatening situation. They try to escape, but that makes the building collapse even more around them. So they know they can't do anything. They're panicking. So one of them suggests, let's tell each other a story out of our lives, something really important that made us who we are today. And right away, everybody thinks this is a terrible idea. And one of them says, I don't even have a story to tell. What am I going to talk about? And then the character says, I don't believe that's true. Everyone has a story, at least one amazing thing. And when I was writing, we'll talk more about the writing process later. But as I was writing, I don't always know what's going to happen in my stories. But as I wrote that line, it was kind of like a resonance went through me. And I understood that that is what this novel is going to be about. One amazing thing, each one having at least one amazing story. And as they're telling their stories to each other and listening to their stories and understanding, from a group of strangers, they are transformed into a community that cares for each other. So I think that some of the things I wanted to say in that book is, yes, everyone has a story, although we don't always recognize it. So we have to take a little bit of internal time to recognize our story. And then, of course, there are other stories floating in the air around us. And we have to be sensitive to those stories, and they will begin to come to us. And also that the sharing of stories creates a community. That's really important. And I've had a lot of experiences, especially when I was volunteering after Hurricane Katrina. A lot of the survivors came to Houston, and I was volunteering with them. And when they shared their stories, I could see the power of story, and I could see that how them telling and me listening made us into a caring community.
Isn't it amazing how tribes and cultures across the world, even though the names and the venues may change and mannerisms may change, but the stories that people tell, the people have the same characteristics. The heroes and the villains have the same characteristics all over. So whether it is in India or anywhere, or a tribe anywhere, somewhere deep in the African forests, the characteristics of the villains and the heroes will remain the same. So there is that deep connect that stories bring to us.
Yes, I think there's two interesting things to think about. One is that storytelling, as far as I know, is a uniquely human activity. It's the way in which we make sense of our world. And therefore, storytellers have been there like way back in time, as far back as we remember. If we look at the ancient cave paintings, there are paintings of storytellers telling stories, people sitting around the fire. And now we tell our stories in many different ways, including on social media. We tell, flash fiction. It's just amazing. But that desire to communicate, to tell a story, is very important, because through stories, we are making sense of our world. Things that don't make sense, when we see them as stories, they begin to make sense. And in situations where we feel disempowered, when we can tell a story with us in it, usually as the main character, it is very empowering. So I think stories do so much. It's just quite amazing, even like physically, what stories do to our brain. And I know you were talking to me about that as well.
Yeah, narrative imagining is, I think, an integral part of our brains and the way we think about the future, the way we think about everything. For instance, you're just sitting bored and you look at a chair, and it could just be a chair, or you start building a story around it, thinking, okay, this chair is lying here in the Litfest. Can you imagine who are the celebrity authors who must have sat on it? And so without even knowing, every day, when we gossip, when we share things that happen in our lives on a daily basis, we are telling stories all the time. We are really doing. So can you imagine when 25,000 stories came to us, how fascinating it was for us to sit and read them? I'm not saying all 25,000 were just as good, nor did I read all 25,000 of them, impossible. But some of them were fascinating, and we collected, Chitra, as you know, we launched about 111 authors into the literary firmament last year with season 1 of Write India. And can you imagine, the stories that came to us came from 2,800 cities in the country.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
2,800 cities. And we were tickled to see names of cities and towns we'd never heard of before. And people sent us stories from there. And the kind of people who wrote, so it's not just authors, it's not just it's not just students, or it's not just people, housewives who are not doing something else. The maximum number of stories, of course, we got from students and IT professionals. But we got the third largest number of stories came in from, doctors, came in from businessmen, and we got from engineers. Engineers sent us a lot of stories. Can you imagine engineers, doctors writing stories? There were at least 4 ISRO scientists who wrote the stories. This year, there has already been a new group which has been added, you know. There are people, somebody who sent us a story. There are about 20 poets who sent us stories. In the field for profession, they've written poets. So they sent us stories. There's a yogi who sent us a story. He says yogi. There's a waitress who sent a story. She says waitress. So it is really interesting, the facts and figures that are coming out from there's a story there itself, the kind of people who are participating and writing. When you think of your stories, Chitra, is it the imagining which is different, the imagination which is different for an author, for a successful author like you? Or is it what you do with that imagination, what you do with the stories which could be available to anybody else? What makes the difference?
Well, there's a couple of different kinds of stories I write. And more now, I'm writing the second kind. So I should say there's a couple of kinds of stories that people write. The first kind of story is based on our immediate experience. It may or may not be autobiographical. So, you know, sometimes people have had amazing things happening in their lives, maybe difficult, tragic, dramatic things happening in their lives, and they might be able to create a story around that. Many writers, their early novels really go back into their own lives in some way or other. Arundhati Roy's God of Small Things is, you know, largely based on what had happened to her mother. If you go even further back, Charles Dickens, when he's writing David Copperfield, he's writing about his own childhood in the form of fiction. So that's a very interesting kind of story. And not only is it very authentic and powerful because it's your story, you know it best, but it's also very, I think, cleansing. It's very healing to be able to write especially traumatic stories and kind of shape them into art and send them into the world. So that's one kind of story. But as you continue being a writer and as you now know that this is what I want to do, I want to write stories, because writing stories, not only is it important, it's very pleasurable, it's very exciting. Every day is something new, it's very creative. People who write and read stories, studies have said, there are parts of our brain that get developed more, and especially the compassionate center in the brain, the area that allows empathy, that grows in storytellers and story readers or listeners. So it's very interesting. The second kind of story then is based on the imagination. And that's very, very powerful, very important. There's no end to it. All you have to do is to be able to imagine the lives of other people. Now, sometimes those imagined lives are in the community around you, so I certainly write that kind of story. Many of my works that are contemporary, based on the immigrant experience, set partly in the US and partly in India, are those kinds of stories. So I look at society around me. I become interested in certain social incidents or movements or historic incidents or movements. For instance, in my novel, Oleander Girl, set half in India and half in the US, one of the things I was interested to look at is how the world in the US changed for immigrants after 9/11, after the towers, were destroyed. And right around the same time here in India, the Godhra riots were going on. And how did that change Hindu-Muslim relationships? My story, like many of my stories, is set in Kolkata, the city where I was born. And even all the way across the country from the Godhra riots, there were serious implications. So I was looking at these social political angles. But also then there are timeless topics that I'm interested in. And one of them in Oleander Girl is the relationship between mothers and daughters. And this daughter, her mother died in childbirth, and yet she thinks of her a lot. And how does that happen? And sometimes when we're writing, we go into whole other fields. So one of my favorite novels of my own that was really challenging to write, but that I was really happy with, is Palace of Illusions, based in the world of the Mahabharata, in the time of the Mahabharata, told from Draupadi's viewpoint. And there I was completely in the world of the imagination. I did do a lot of research, a different kind of research, reading many versions of the Mahabharata. And the result was a whole other kind of story. So it was a story where the bare bones of that story were already given to me. And I had to stay. I wanted to stay. I decided. Other people have made different decisions when writing about mythology. But I wanted to stay very close to the original Mahabharata. So I was telling a story, but like the boundaries were already given to me. And that was a special kind of challenge and a special kind of pleasure to say, okay, I'm working within this. How can I still make it original and different? So these are just some kinds of stories. And really, our stories, as we put them in books, they have beginnings and endings. But I think the story goes on.
Yeah. I must say that Palace of Illusions is my absolute favorite where your books are concerned. It's the book I go back to. In fact, one of my most favorites, why only out of your books. It's the book I keep going back to. And I know a lot of people who totally love it. So it is so fascinating to be hearing the story of the Mahabharata through Draupadi's voice. And you gave her a voice and you gave her the persona of a very strong woman who makes her own choices, and everything that happens because of the choices that she makes, which is fascinating. All your books have these very strong women characters, and you deal with this theme of mother-daughter relationship again and again through your books. Any particular reason for that?
Well, I think my own relationship with my mother was a very strong one. For many years of my growing up life, she was a single parent. She brought up myself and my two younger brothers. So she was a big influence in my life. We did not always have, a lovey-lovey relationship.
Yeah, nobody does.
There was a lot of conflict. But when I look back on her life and thinking about her, she's now passed away. I'm just amazed at how strong she was, how well she brought us up, how hard she fought to bring us up according to her values.
Yes.
And I guess, that's
where
really,
you keep going back to it again and
that's
again.
one
Yes.
of the reasons.
Yeah.
Now, I also like that. I think that's what made me interested in this mother-daughter relationship, or let's say a parent-child relationship, which no matter what is the oldest relationship you have in your life, and in the case of the mother and the child, it's a relationship that begins before you're born. I mean, how special is that? Now, this relationship changes in different times, in different places, in different families, and certainly because of immigration. And my latest novel, Before We Visit the Goddess, looks at the effect of immigration on mothers and daughters. Or
that really deals
in
with
families.
all three things that you spoke about, the mothers, daughters, the difficult relationship, different places, immigrants, and deals with all of it. But interestingly, all three women there, and maybe women in some of your other novels also, they keep going back to something as traditional as cooking to assert their power, particularly in Before We Visit the Goddess. So what other tools of asserting the power does a strong woman have? Why do they keep going back to cooking
Well,
these books?
Before We Visit the Goddess, it's about a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter. And the grandmother is of my own mother's generation. She's around college age right after independence, a little after independence of India. And she wants very much to be her own woman and be successful and stand on her own feet. And there are not many venues for her. She does go to college, but it doesn't work out the way she thinks she will. And she has this deep creative need, and she has a talent. She's a very talented sweet maker, as was her mother before. So for her, that becomes a venue. Her daughter, after many ups and downs, she's in America, and she will become a food blogger. So she's doing the same thing completely in her own way, and she is cooking fusion food.
Yeah.
Now her daughter is going to go a whole other route, and she says, cooking is not my thing. So she's going to find a whole different way of being successful.
Or she may come back to it in
Yes,
some other way.
she might come back to
Yeah.
it, because that novel is about how we go away from our roots and how sometimes, in some ways, we come back to them. What's our relationship with our roots and our heritage? Now, Panchali in the Mahabharata is a very good cook. I didn't make that up. That's from the Mahabharata itself. And cooking early in her marriage becomes kind of a power struggle between her and her mother-in-law, who tests her by telling her to cook things but doesn't give her the right ingredients to cook them. So it's like a little test of her intellect and ingenuity. But otherwise, Panchali is powerful in
in other ways.
Yes.
So, Chitra, when stories are drawn from so much that is autobiographical, that is within us, that is part of our lives and the people that we meet, can there come a time when stories dry up?
That's a very good question. And
For
I think,
instance,
and I talk to my students about it.
Yeah. A lot of people who write very popular first novels are scared of writing a second one, like Elizabeth Gilbert. After writing Eat, Pray, Love, for a long time she said she was very scared of writing again.
Yes. Now, so let's hold off to this on the second one. So the first thing is that I tell this to my student, when we are writing, the inspiration might be autobiographical, but at a certain point, we are the writer. And that's our first job. We're an artist, we're creating a product, an art product. And so we have to be able to separate the story from the origins of the story and see it as a construction. And we need to understand certain things about the story, such as what is going to create suspense? How do we build conflict? How do we make the character complex? How do we show the relationship changing between characters? Which means that I have to move away from my source material and immerse myself as a writer in the world of the story. The wonderful writing teacher John Gardner calls it the fictive dream, the fictive dream. We have to fall into the fictive dream and stay there. So now we're in the world of the story, and the characters, if we've imagined this right, they begin to do things that we had not necessarily planned. And that's when we know that the fictive dream is really working. Okay? So, we begin to understand motivations in those characters that we didn't really intend to put there. And that is a magical moment when the story comes alive.
So that is what authors mean when they say that sometimes the story writes itself. The characters make moves that we didn't know anything about. That puts it in context, because otherwise it sounds pretty weird when they say it,
Well, sometimes I laugh about it and I say that one of the reasons I became a fiction writer is because in my real life, in the real world, I had very little control of what was happening. So I thought, at least in the fictional world, I'm going to control everything. But I realized that no, especially if I wanted the stories to be good, I had to give up the idea of control and really see what comes from inside the character. Really allow the character, sometimes to grow and develop and make mistakes and even be like a bad person, not like a bad person, but a kind of complicated mixture of good and evil, white and black. And that's what makes good stories. Yeah. So it's really important to not try and control the story, to allow the story to kind of organically grow and develop, and to listen to what the story is trying to tell us.
So as readers, when we pick up a book, we want our emotions to be played with. We want moments of agitation. But then at the end of it, we want that everything that fell should rise again, and there should be a happy ending. So what are the elements that go into a story that really appeals to readers? And do you really think about your reader when you're writing your story?
Those are all very good questions. So I'll start with the last one. Do I think about the reader when I'm writing the story? At a certain point of writing the story, I have to forget about the reader. I have to be immersed in that fictive dream, and I have to only care about creating a good story. Now, but I know through years of writing stories and teaching about writing stories that there are elements that make a story powerful. And if you go back to the ancient stories, you will find these elements occurring over and over again. So we know that they are true and they work. They're not formulaic, because depending on the story, they will come out differently in each story. But one of the, and I'll give you one of them, which if you are writers in the audience, definitely you can check it out for yourself, is that early in the story, we need to know what is it that the character really wants. What is the desire of the character? And then we have to know what is standing between the character and the achievement of that desire. So in Palace of Illusions, right from the beginning, Panchali wants a home of her own. She wants a home where she's going to be mistress of the home. She doesn't feel that she fits in her father's house because biologically she is not her father's daughter. She has no mother. She came out of the fire, and she feels that I'm meant for something else. So she has a dream, she has a vision, she has a desire. She doesn't know how to achieve it. And as her story goes along, there are many obstacles placed between her and her desire. So when we have those elements, that increases drama, increases conflict and tension, and as readers, we really like that. We like the excitement, we like the suspense of kind of knowing but not knowing how it's going to happen. And that is why we love the mythic stories, because they have these central elements occurring over and over, and they show the, I don't know, the immensity of the human spirit as it tries, might not be successful, but as it tries to overcome the odds that are placed in front of it. So, stories may or may not have happy endings. I think some very powerful and popular novels don't have what we think of as happy endings, because the character doesn't necessarily get what they wanted. But as long as there's a growth process, and as long as readers we learn something about the nature of the world, the nature of life, I think that satisfies readers in a whole other way.
Yeah, sometimes it's the tragic endings that remain with you, and those are the stories that refuse to go away from your mind.
That's right.
Yeah, but you do feel sad after reading a story like that.
Well, you know, Aristotle said this a long time back when he was writing about the power of tragedy and why people love tragedy. And I'm going to paraphrase what he said more poetically. But he said, one of the great pleasures of reading tragedy is that after you read it and you come back to your life, boy, your life looks a lot better.
Yeah.
So there is that satisfaction. You are shaken by all these emotions and you see all this tragedy. And then in that context, really, you have a different understanding and a different appreciation of your own struggles in your own life.
Yeah, you do get caught up totally when you're reading a story. Sometimes somebody talks to you and you're shaken out of your book and you hate being brought back to reality. And if you were to read a story like that, yes, I can imagine coming back and saying, thank God, it's not me, it's not happening to me. So, Chitra, I know it works differently for different writers, but some of them say they have a complete storyboard, they have 150 questions for each character, which they answer, and they know exactly what's going to happen from the beginning till the end, and then they structure their story and write in between. Does it work like that for you, or are you a more spontaneous kind of a writer?
I am a much more spontaneous kind of writer. I do have to know certain things before I start a story. I have to understand at least one of the main characters. I have to understand the setting of the story. So I have to be able to imagine where that setting is. So in the beginning, for instance, of Before We Visit the Goddess, Before We Visit the Goddess is a story told not in chronological order, but according to important events in the lives of these three women. And it works the way memory works. If you think about how you remember things, you don't remember things chronologically, but certain emotionally powerful things come up. So it begins with the grandmother, who is now old. She's retired back to a little Bengal village, and it's a dark and rainy night. The phone rings. It's her daughter at the other end, her daughter who's in the United States, and she's called to tell her that the granddaughter has made or is on the verge of making a really bad decision. And she says, you're the grandmother, write to her, persuade her not to do this. Okay, so I knew that much when I began before we visit the goddess. So I knew there were 3 characters. I knew the grandmother the most at that point, and I had a very good sense of the setting because the village that I imagined was my grandfather's village where I had spent many years of my childhood. And I knew the conflict. There's a conflict, there's a situation that's tense, the granddaughter is about to make a big mistake. Is the grandmother going to be able to stop her? How is she going to be able to stop her? So I knew the questions, but I didn't know the answers. And as I wrote that story, I came up with the answer.
You didn't know the backstory of the grandmother, nothing till then.
I did not know the
That is
backstory of the
amazing.
grandmother. I knew at that point that the grandmother had had a difficult life, that she had struggled very hard to become an independent woman. That I knew that much.
You know, this is serendipity, and which is why I've had a smile on my face while listening to Chitra just now. Of all the passages in all her books, the one that I picked up to read out to you today to show how beautiful her writing is, it is awesome, is the passage that she just spoke about. So I'm going to read out a little bit from there to you.
That's really serendipitous. I didn't know that.
Yeah, you didn't know it because I didn't tell you. So it starts like this. She lifts her eyes, and there is death in the corner. But not like a king with iron crown, as the epics claimed. Why, it is a gentle brush loaded with white paint. It descends upon her with gentle suddenness, obliterating the shape of the world. How beautifully put.
Thank
How
you.
beautifully
Thank
put,
you so
really.
much.
And the book is, not just this book, but the other books are full of phrases and passages. Like, so she refers to the past and says, the past, the vessel in which all emotions curdle to regret. How beautifully put. These are the
you.
bits of your books that I totally love. So do you labor over these bits, these phrases, or do
Yes.
they just come out naturally?
A combination. You know, sometimes, yes, a phrase will come. Sometimes, though, I have to sit and think. So I'm not a very fast writer. My books will take me 2 years to write, maybe 3 years. Palace of Illusion took me over 3 years between the research and the writing. I do a lot of rewriting, editing for myself. And I tell my students that that's really important. Because when we finish the story, it really is the first draft. And we are so blessed because we work in a medium where we can continue improving it. Other people like sculptors or painters, they can't do that. They have that medium.
Yeah, never thought of it that way.
If they're chiseling that, block of stone, they better get it right. Otherwise, they'll have to throw the whole thing away. But the wonderful thing I tell my students is, your first draft can be really bad, but no one in the world will know it, right? But the thing you have to do is then you have to rework it. And my students resist revision. I resist revision. But once we start doing it, first we have to put the book aside, or the story aside for a little bit. And that is a magical event in itself. And if I know there are writers in this audience, I'm going to ask for a show of hands. How many people have put the stories aside, and when you came back to it, you began to see different things in it? Has that happened to people? Yes, I see the hands go up. Because, right, I write the story, I look at it, and it seems perfect to me at that point. It's like, wow, this story, it came from God right through my computer into the world. It's perfect. But 1 week later, I will see things in that story that I didn't see before. And I have to be willing to do that work. Because now I begin to see, okay, this scene isn't beautiful, isn't as clear as before, this character isn't as complicated, all right, this dialogue doesn't sound right. I have to be my strongest, most honest critic. And I have to be willing to write a second draft, maybe a third draft, and I do a lot of that.
So the responsibility must be much more because you teach creative writing. So each book of yours becomes like, a textbook for your students. So when they go through it, they
That
get to
is a scary thought.
So,
they aren't allowed to discuss my books in the classes I teach.
not.
That would just be too much.
So, since there are a lot of writers and people who aspire to be writers in the audience here, would you like to give a few more tips to them on how to start writing, and how to go about it, should they be even thinking about who is going to publish their book when they start writing. And of course, after that, I'll ask you to give tips to Write India participants who are going to write for you.
Sure. So one of the things I tell my students is, when you start writing, please don't think about publishing. Because what happens is that just, that just kind of makes the imagination atrophy. Because now you're thinking about, oh, what sells? And as soon as you're thinking about what might sell, you've compromised your story. So you have to not think about that. You have to have some trust in yourself. I'm going to write the best story. I'm going to write it the best way I know how. And I trust myself. I trust the story that it will be powerful enough to find an audience. I really believe that. That's how I write. Okay. I mean, yes, I don't want to write a story that is not going to appeal to readers. That's a whole different thing. I have to say, these are the powerful elements in the story. This is what other people will connect to. This is what will reach people's hearts. I need to know that. I need to understand what are the major human themes that I'm interested in exploring. But if I start thinking about sales and market and agents and publishers, I'm taking the creative impulse and kind of twisting it. And then I'm really reducing the power of my ability to write. So I always tell my students, think of the best story you can write, okay? Think of why it's a good story. What are the deep human elements in it that will appeal to people? What are maybe important social things you're trying to say? Because ultimately, if our writing is not going to make a difference in the world, if it's not going to make a difference to readers, why are we even writing? If I want to make money, I shouldn't have gone into writing. I should have gone into maybe investment banking or something like that, right? So yes, when the book is successful, the book will make enough money. But I can't start at that end. I have to start at this end and say, how do I make this story the absolute best story? So the other thing I tell my students is, think about, how are you going to make your story original? And I think about that myself. What am I going to put in it that's not in any other story? Okay? And when I was writing Palace of Illusions, for example, I had a real challenge because the Mahabharata, the original, had been written, many versions had been written, modern novels had been written about it, and now my challenge was, I have to do something that's different. And I had to answer that question for myself. So I say to my students, how is your story going to be different from another story which is about a similar subject? And once we understand what makes it original and different, it could be on the level of character, it could be on the level of style, it could be on the level of incident, it could be how we describe setting, it could be the way in which words are put together, my vocabulary, it could be all of the above. That's what's going to make that book stand out. That's hopefully what's going to make people remember that book and want to come back to that book, tell their friends about that book, and all of the above. But we have to start with the story.
So when you wrote Palace of Illusions, it was a swing away from your regular kind of writing. Why do you think the sudden re-emergence of interest in mythology? Why is everybody taking a go at it? Every author, every writer, even a first-time writer. Is it because the story structure is easily available and it's just a rewriting from another perspective? And why are readers so interested in reading it all over again?
That is very interesting. In my case, for me, I have been wanting to write the story of the Mahabharata from a woman's point of view for a long time.
And now the Ramayana also, I believe.
And now I'm working on the Ramayana from Sita's point of view. That's the next book that will come out. I'm almost at the end of the first draft, but I will be revising, as I said, extensively. Then it'll go to my editor, who might even be in the audience here today, and she's a wonderful editor. She's going to give me lots of advice, and I'm going to edit the whole thing again after I look at her. But I started thinking about writing the story of the Mahabharata when I was a teenager, long before I thought I would become a writer and write that story. And that's because my grandfather was a great storyteller, and my happiest memories of childhood are sitting with him. He lived in the village, so I would go during my school holidays, and my cousins and I would sit around one of those kerosene lanterns, and he would tell these wonderful stories out of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. But as soon as I grew old enough to think critically for myself, I began to realize that all these stories, and when I read the traditional Ramayana and Mahabharata, they're so male-focused. So I was like, someone needs to write about what the women are feeling at this time, and how are they responding to this? What are they thinking? And how do their actions lead to some important events that then occur? And so I'd been thinking about it for a long time.
Did you think about it back then in childhood as well?
I must have been like a teenager. And I thought about this subject, why it's important to, or why it would be wonderful to have a Mahabharata from a woman's point of view. I did not think I would write it. I didn't think at that point that I would be a writer.
To know.
I just wanted that book to be there.
Yes.
And then I was like, I started writing. I wrote Arranged Marriage, a collection of short stories. I began to win awards. The books are now translated in different languages. And I'm like, I want to write that story, okay? But this is earlier in my career, and I'm too scared to write that story because it's a big story. It's going to require a lot of research, a lot of work, and really thinking through Draupadi's character. So I keep pushing it back. I keep taking notes on it, but I'm pushing it back. And then one day, do you know how thoughts come to us? I wake up in the morning and I say, what if I die? I better write this book before I die. And so I start writing The Palace of Illusions. And one of the weird things that happens is I start writing Palace of Illusions, and lightning strikes our house. So my wonderful husband, Murthy, who's in the audience, he's like, are you sure you should be writing this book? Maybe this is a message from the gods. But by then, I'm really deep into that creative process, and I'm like, that must be inspiration, divine inspiration coming.
That was a sign, not that God is against it, but that God is with you while you're writing it, probably.
That is what I chose to interpret it as.
So, a lot of these participants were Right India, and we have participants from the ages of 10 to 90.
Just one thing that you asked me that I didn't answer. I think the mythological stories are always powerful. I think we go through cycles in literature, and right now, many people are realizing that power and wanting to tell that story. Now, there have been periods in Europe and America and other places where mythological stories were written.
Yeah.
So I think each region of the world, there are times when mythology seems really, really important, relevant, and powerful.
That's interesting. So you think there are certain lessons we need to learn and certain lessons that are coming through the retelling of mythology?
Yes, or at least, people are understanding something that is true always, which is that these mythological stories have important things to teach us. Yeah. They are timeless. We need to think about them.
Yes, okay. And today, of course, a vast expanse of people are reading these stories. It's not just a few readers. Like bookshops also are reporting that the footfall has really increased. Interestingly, at a time when we imagined that people would not be reading physical books as much as they did earlier, but what with all these literature festivals and even Right India, we'll take some credit for that as well. People are getting back into reading a lot and seeing so many authors, their favorite authors like you, being able to interact with you, talk to you. I think all that makes a big difference, and people are getting back to reading in a big way.
I'm so happy about that, because I think reading is one of the most wonderful, most growth-inducing human experiences. And to be on either end of it, creating the book or receiving the book, that whole experience is just amazing. I have grown so much from reading myself. Books have been my most important teachers. And there's a quote that I keep near my writing desk. It's from Kafka. And Kafka says, a book should be an axe to shatter the frozen sea that is inside us.
Wow.
So that is my hope.
Yes, that's beautiful.
That is my hope, that that's what my books will do, at least to a small extent.
So as a writer, I do know the high that one gets out of writing. I write a lot of non-fiction, my column. And I know that at the end of writing a column, which I consider good, I'm almost like, flying. You feel so good.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
you feel so good. It's like, you're drunk or you're flying and you're so happy about it. And the creative process is, of course, painful. But once you get there and you finish it, you feel great. So as a reader also, the moment you buy a book, and you've got a new book in your hand, and before you start it, you want to spend that time just looking at the book, just enjoying it, just smelling it, and just keeping it on the side table, and having a collection of books there. Okay, I have all that to read, so many hours of pleasure, and then you get into it. So it's interesting to know, to discuss this, that as writers and as readers, you get the same kind of a feeling in the creative process and the process of reading what you have created.
Yes, because something that I'm very aware of is that the final product of the book is created in the reader's imagination, right?
Beautifully put.
And therefore, I write a book, but I hear back from readers, and they have such different responses to it. It's wonderful. It's magical. That is the power of story. I say it, it means something to me, but you receive it, it means something else to you. It's multifaceted.
Yeah.
And we're each putting something into that story to bring it alive.
So many different interpretations of the same thing. So a lot of Right India participants, like I said, we've had them from the ages of 10 to 90. 90-year-old man has been our oldest participant for Right India Stories. A lot of them often ask us, how do you choose the stories? How do you choose the best stories? Who are the winners? Lots of people say, I write so many stories, I've participated for all authors, and I've never won. So I want to stop writing now. And I keep telling them all, and the message we keep sending to them all is that you have become a winner the moment you finished the story, you completed the story, and you sent it to us. There are a lot of people out there who've never written a story, who just keep thinking about it throughout their lives.
Right.
So you've completed a story, you've sent it to us, you have a story in your hand. Out of the thousands of entries, we can't have more than 10 winners. So those winners also, who knows? I mean, if you and I sit and select the top 10 winners for your month, supposing we were to ask somebody else to get into the judgment process, the person
might
will choose
choose a
completely different
yes,
stories.
absolutely.
So it doesn't really matter. But the things that work for me when I'm reading those stories, the winners clearly are those where the story stays in my mind. After reading it, I walk away from it, and the story walks with me. There's stories where
That's
emotions,
a great way of putting it. I agree.
yeah, and where emotions are aroused. So you do want to be connected emotionally to a story when you're reading it.
I agree.
Yeah, and also, though not necessarily, but a story where very beautiful turns of phrases, language have been used, although we do not really use that as a criteria for Right India, because there are a lot of people who cannot write as beautifully, and editing can possibly take care of that. But the story itself is the most important thing.
Right.
Would you agree?
And I agree with those things, and I'd add one more, which is complexity of character. Does the character surprise me at some point in this story? I think this...
Ma'am, I'm really sorry to interrupt, but we have 5 minutes left if
Okay.
we wish to go for a Q&A.
Yes, we
Shall
do,
we?
absolutely. I
Yes.
didn't realize.
Yeah.
I thought
Questions from the audience?
I didn't
know
want to interrupt you.
time
There was
just-
a intense conversation happening, so I was
So
waiting
questions,
patiently.
please. All right, there.
We
the
just have
lady in
5
red.
minutes, so keep your questions really very
Yeah.
short.
Keep the questions
crisp.
very short, to the point.
Yes.
Ma'am, I've read all your stories, and especially the Before We Visit Goddess. In that, I've seen that you have portrayed one event from different time zone. So that makes the characters float. For example, at times you like the characters, and then you look at the same angle, from different angle, and you feel like there is something different else angle which you have not portrayed. My question is that, ma'am, when I look about all your fictions, they are talking about immigrant experiences. And there are other writers like Bharti Mukherjee, Jhumpa Lahiri, who write about the same thing, but all your fictions talk about acculturation. So is acculturation a kind of a remedy for today's multicultural society, which ends all your fictions with an optimistic note?
That's a great question. I do write about the immigrant experience. I hope in different books I'm looking at it from many different angles. And the immigration stories are also set in different periods. And I think the whole idea of immigration or migration is becoming even more powerful in a different way because it's such a global world we live in that many people have experienced moving away to a different culture. It could even be within the same country, but if you move to a very different place, you've really migrated from your own comfortable home environment. How does that change us? What are the pluses and minuses? And if you're going halfway into halfway across the world into a whole different culture, that just ratchets up everything and makes it much more intense. And there's a power in that I'm always interested in exploring. I will talk more about that in my panel later on today at 4:30. So, but yes, I find that it's always changing, always happening. It is a fact of our world, and it's becoming increasingly politically important.
Thank you
Another
so
question?
much. We can take
Okay,
one
there's a lady
final
already
question.
standing.
Okay. Chitra, you seem to understand women very well, but I'm sure you confront a character where the character is not like you. Then how do you deal with that? How do you separate the two threads?
Yes, good question. In fact, most of the characters that I write, pretty much all the characters I write about are not like me. Their lives are much more exciting than mine. And, they are making amazing choices that will change their worlds. They are also often living on the edge, maybe doing things that they shouldn't be doing. They're impelled by various passions to act unwisely. Not that I'm saying I always act wisely, but my characters are much more dramatic. So right in the beginning of the story, I separate. There will always be a little part of me in the character, and I tell this to my students, separate, because once that character becomes too autobiographical, you'll have difficulty making the character take the kinds of risks that the story requires, make the kind of maybe negative decisions that the story requires the character to make.
Thank you so much. I am really sorry, but
Take
actually,
one
we can
quick
take
question.
one quick
Yes.
question. Yeah, we can
Yeah.
take one quick question.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Good
DJ.
morning. Ma'am, while writing a book, does it happen to you that you love one character and you hate one character, although both the characters are created by you? And number two, one more. And suppose if the situation arises that you have to kill your favorite character, do you get emotional? Do you cry? Do your eyes get moist? It happens to us as a reader.
Okay, yes. I'll answer the second question first. I do get emotional because I have to feel what the character is feeling. If I can't feel it when I'm writing it emotionally, I don't think the characters will come alive to the reader. The reader won't feel it. If I don't even feel it when I'm writing it, how will the reader feel it when they're reading it? So I have to feel. And as a result, although yes, there are characters I admire more and maybe identify with their values more, I have to understand each character just as much. So I might like one character more than another, but as kind of the creative mind behind the characters, I have to love each one equally. Otherwise, they won't come alive, and then the story will fall flat. So that's something for writers in the audience to think about as we end. You may like characters differently, but you have to love them all the same because you're creating them all. You have to get inside them, and you have to cry when bad things happen to them. Thank you. You've been a great audience.
Thank you.
I'm really sorry we couldn't give you the 15 minutes for the questions. We didn't get the prompt in time. But do please write for Write India, write for Chitra. She's the author of the month this month. Until the 30th, you can send in your stories. Go to toi.in/WriteIndia. Pick up her passage, full passage, and the rules that she's given with it will really guide you beautifully into the art of creative writing. So do write for Write India. Thank you very much.